The boots were still laced. That was the first thing Elias Cord noticed. Not the boy's shallow breathing, not the blood crusted along his jaw, not the way his fingers had curled around the barn post like he'd been trying to hold the whole world together with one hand. It was the boots, laced tight, double-knotted the way a child ties his shoes when someone has told him he might need to run. Elias stood in the doorway of his barn with a lantern held low, the September wind pushing cold fingers against the back of his neck. And he did not move for a long time. The barn smelled of hay and old leather, and something beneath that. Iron, faint, the kind of smell that follows a man who has been hurt and hasn't stopped moving long enough to know it. The boy was maybe 12, maybe less. Hard to tell with the dirt and the hollows beneath his eyes. He was wedged between two hay bales in the far corner, legs folded under him, head tipped against the post at an angle that would leave a neckache for 3 days. Asleep, deeply, desperately asleep, in the way that people sleep when their body simply refuses to carry them one more mile. Elias did not call out. He did not step forward. He stood in that doorway for what felt like a long time, long enough for the lantern flame to steady, and the horse in the first stall to stop her nervous shuffling and go quiet again. Then he lifted the lantern a little higher, and he looked. The boy's coat was too large by 2 sizes. A man's coat, rough canvas, the collar frayed to strings. Beneath it, a shirt that had once been white. One knee of his trousers was torn open at the bone, and through the gap Elias could see a gash that had been packed with something, leaves maybe, or torn cloth, and had not been properly cleaned. The kind of wound that goes septic in 3 days in dry country. But it was the boots that kept pulling Elias's eye back. Good boots once, someone had made them well. The leather was cracked now, the soles worn nearly through at the heel, but the stitching along the toe box was fine. Careful work, the kind a craftsman does for someone he cares about. And they were laced tight, double-knotted with the patience and intention of a child who had been told, "Keep them on, whatever happens, keep them on." Elias set the lantern down on the post just inside the door. He crossed the barn slowly, not stepping on the boards he knew would creak. Old habit, the kind that doesn't leave you. He crouched down 4 feet from the boy and looked at him in the quiet way a man looks at something he hasn't decided what to do about yet. The boy's face, beneath the bruising, was a child's face, nothing more. There was no hardness in it the way there was in the faces of the young men who came through Harlan County pretending to be outlaws. This was a face that had seen something it wasn't ready to see and had simply kept moving because stopping felt like dying. A scar ran from the boy's left ear to his chin, old, fully healed, the kind that had been made years ago and left without care. Whatever had given him that scar had done it when he was very young. Elias straightened up. He looked at the door, then at the boy, then at the lantern. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood along the fence line with a sound like distant water. The stars were out over the flats in great cold numbers. Nothing moved on the road in either direction. He'd been ranching this land alone for 6 years. The Cord property, 230 acres of dry grass, a creek that ran true in spring and trickled in fall, a house his wife had helped him build the first 2 years and had died in the 3rd. There were no neighbors within 6 miles who didn't have opinions about his business, and every man in Caldwell knew Elias Cord kept to himself the way a stone keeps to a riverbed, not from coldness, but from weight. He was not a man who looked for trouble. He was not a man who turned from it either. He went to the house, moved quietly through the kitchen, and came back with a blanket, a tin cup of water, and a cloth. He draped the blanket over the boy without waking him. He set the water within reach. Then he sat himself on an overturned bucket 3 feet away, his back against the stall post, and he waited. He was still sitting there when the boy's eyes opened just before dawn. The boy didn't scream. He didn't bolt. His eyes opened and found Elias in the pale grey light, and he went very still. The stillness of a small animal that has learned stillness is the first defense. His hand moved toward the inside of his coat. "There's water beside you," Elias said. His voice was low, unhurried, the way a man talks to a spooked horse. The boy's hand stopped. "You don't have anything I want," Elias said. "Drink the water if you want it." A long silence. The boy's eyes moved to the cup, then back to Elias. "I wasn't going to steal," the boy said. His voice came out cracked and small, like something that had been used hard and put away wet. "I know," Elias said. "I just needed—" The boy stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands. "I know," Elias said again. Outside, the first bird started up in the cottonwood. The light came up slow and golden over the ridge, the way it does in September when the season is thinking about turning. The horse blew softly in her stall. The boy reached for the water, and it was in that reaching and that one small, exhausted, reluctant gesture of trust that Elias Cord felt something shift in the quiet architecture of his days, something he hadn't felt move in a long, long time. He didn't name it yet, but the boy drank every drop of water in that cup, and when he lowered it, his hands were still shaking. And they were the hands of someone who had been guarding something alone for a very long time. He told Elias his name was Kit. Just Kit. No family name offered, none pressed. He said it the way a person gives the smallest piece of themselves they can manage and calls it enough. Elias fed him at the kitchen table. Beans and cornbread left from the night before, warmed on the iron stove. Kit sat at the edge of the chair the way a guest sits when they're not sure they're welcome, which is to say, both feet flat on the floor and his weight forward, ready. He ate without looking up, except once, briefly, when Elias turned his back to refill the coffee, and Elias, who had learned to see things he wasn't supposed to see, caught the motion in the window's reflection. The boy's eyes swept the room in that single second. Doors, walls, the knife block by the sink, the window above the basin, then back to the plate. He'd been taught to read a room for exits. Elias sat across from him and drank his coffee and said nothing about that. "That knee needs cleaning," Elias said finally. "It's all right." "It isn't. It'll go green by Sunday." Kit said nothing. He put another piece of cornbread in his mouth and chewed, and the line of his jaw was stubborn in the way only the very young can be stubborn. Absolute, uncomplicated, without room for negotiation. "I have carbolic and clean cloth," Elias said. "You let me clean it. You can sleep in the barn tonight. Real sleep, not with one eye open." The boy looked up at that. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief. It was closer to the expression of a man who has been walking into a headwind for so long that when it stops, the stillness itself feels threatening. "Why?" Kit said. Elias looked at him over the rim of the coffee cup. "Because you're 12 years old and you're alone and your knee is going to kill you if nobody cleans it. That's enough reason." "I'm 13. My error." Kit looked back at his plate. A long moment passed. "All right," he said quietly. The cleaning took 20 minutes and was brutal in the honest way that necessary pain always is. The boy did not make a sound, not one, which told Elias more about what his life had been than anything he might have said with words. A child who has learned not to cry out when hurt has learned it somewhere specific. It is not a lesson the world teaches gently. Afterward, Elias wrapped the knee in clean linen, and the boy sat back against the kitchen wall and looked at the ceiling with the blank, exhausted face of someone who has used everything they have. "You're running from something," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Kit's eyes came down from the ceiling. He thought about lying. Elias could see him think about it, the small, visible calculation of a person deciding what version of the truth is survivable. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "Someone," Kit said. "How far back?" 3 days, maybe 4. He paused. "Maybe less now." Elias set down the carbolic and looked at the boy steadily. This was the moment. He could feel it the way a man feels a change in weather before it arrives. There were 2 doors in front of him, and both of them were real. The first door, give the boy a meal, a night's sleep, point him south at daybreak, and let whatever was following him continue to follow. Clean hands, no involvement. The second door asked the next question. He asked the next question. "Who is it?" Kit's eyes dropped to the wrapped knee. His fingers pressed flat against his thigh. "Man named Doyle," he said. "Cutter Doyle." The name landed in the kitchen the way a stone lands in still water. Not violently, but with consequence. Circles spreading out from where it hit. Elias knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. Cutter Doyle moved through the territory the way a bad season moves, following no schedule anyone could predict, leaving particular kinds of damage behind him. He was not an outlaw in the organized sense. He was something older and simpler than that, a man who had decided early that what he wanted he would take, and that anyone standing between him and the wanting was an inconvenience to be cleared. "What does he want with you?" Elias said. Kit said nothing for a moment. Then, "What's mine?" "And what's yours?" The boy reached into the inside of his coat, the same reach he'd made in the barn when he first woke, the reach Elias had thought was for a weapon. He pulled out a small object wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a length of cord, and set it on the table between them without unwrapping it. "That's mine," Kit said. Elias did not reach for it. He looked at it, then at the boy. "I'm not asking you to show me." "I know." Kit pulled it back off the table and tucked it away. "But I wanted you to know it exists." The morning light had moved by now, coming through the east window in a long, bright bar across the kitchen floor. Outside, Elias could hear his horse moving in the paddock, the sound of the wind in the grass, the ordinary music of an ordinary Thursday on the flats. Nothing on the road, nothing yet. He stood up and carried his coffee cup to the basin. He looked out the window at the long, flat road that ran east and west past his property, empty, golden, still. "You can stay," he said without turning around. "Through the weekend, long enough for that knee to hold you." A silence from the table. Then, that's dangerous for you. Probably, Elias agreed. Doyle doesn't... Kit stopped. Started again. He doesn't stop when people ask him to. I'm aware of his reputation. Another silence. Longer this time. Why? The boy said again. The same question as before, but asked differently now. Not with suspicion, but with something rawer than suspicion. Something that had been buried under survival, long enough that it had almost forgotten its own name. Elias turned from the window. He looked at the boy at his kitchen table, the too large coat, the careful eyes, the wrapped knee, the rigid spine that hadn't fully relaxed since the moment he woke in the barn. 13 years old and holding something that a grown man was hunting him across 4 days of dry country to take. Because someone should have done it sooner, Elias said. Finish your breakfast. By midday, 3 riders had passed on the road. None of them slowed, but the third one, a man on a grey roan, turned his head and looked at the Cord property for just a beat too long before the road bent south and took him out of sight. Elias watched from behind the curtain and said nothing. But he went to the cabinet above the fireplace and took down his rifle, and he checked the load. They came on the second morning. Elias heard them before he saw them. The particular sound of 3 horses ridden with purpose across dry ground, hoofbeats spaced with the deliberate rhythm of men who aren't in a hurry because they don't believe they need to be. He was already up, already dressed, his boots on, and his rifle leaned against the wall beside the front door when the shapes of them appeared on the eastern road in the grey-pink light of early morning, like something conjured from the dry air itself. He stepped out onto the porch. The lead rider was a large man on a black horse, built the way certain men are built, who have spent a lifetime being the largest thing in every room they've entered, and have come to mistake their size for authority. His coat was good quality, better than the 2 men flanking him, who were the kind of hired company a man keeps when his decided thinking is someone else's problem. The lead rider had a face that had been left out in the weather a long time and had not improved for it. Cutter Doyle pulled his horse up at the gate and looked at Elias on the porch with the easy patience of a man who has time, who has always had time, because time is something that happens to other people. "Morning," Doyle said. "It is," Elias said. A pause. The 2 flanking riders spread slightly apart, not dramatically, not with theatre, just the quiet, professional reposition of men who do this often enough that it's become habit. "I'm looking for a boy," Doyle said. "Young, dark hair, travelling alone. Seen him?" "Lots of people come through this road," Elias said. "This one's particular," Doyle said. "He's carrying something that belongs to me." "Is that so?" "It is." Doyle's voice was pleasant. It was the pleasantness of someone who uses pleasantness the way other men use a knife, as a tool held to a specific purpose, capable of a different use entirely when the purpose changes. "I'd hate to trouble a man on his own property." "You understand. But if the boy's here, this goes a lot easier for everyone if you just say so." Elias leaned against the porch post and looked out at the 3 men on the road, with the particular quality of stillness that is not passivity, but its opposite, the stillness of a man who has already decided, who is now simply watching the world catch up to his decision. "I run cattle on this land," Elias said. "I don't run boys." Doyle studied him. Something shifted in the pleasant face. Not disappearing exactly, but thinning like light through clouds. You know who I am. I know your name. Then you know I don't make a habit of leaving loose ends. I'm familiar with your methods, Elias said. Inside the house, behind the interior wall of the kitchen, Kit was where Elias had put him before stepping outside, against the wall, below the window line, not moving. They had talked about this last night, when the third rider had slowed on the road. Elias had spoken plainly and without drama, and the boy had listened with his whole body, the way children listen when they finally believe that the adult speaking to them means what they say. If they come, Elias had said, you stay low and you stay quiet. You don't come out no matter what you hear, not for anything. And if something happens to you, Kit had asked, then you go out the back and you run south, but that's not going to happen. How do you know? Elias had looked at the boy for a long moment. Because I've met men like Doyle before, and I've outlasted them. Now on the porch, Doyle swung down from his horse with the slow, deliberate ease of a man making a statement with his body. He handed his reins to the rider on his left without looking. He took 3 steps toward the gate and stopped. I'd like to look at your barn, he said. Just the barn. You let me look, I'm satisfied, and we all go back to our mornings. You're not setting foot on my property, Elias said. Doyle looked at him with something that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite amusement, and lived in the narrow country between those two things. You're making this hard. I'm making it clear, Elias said. There's a difference. The rider on the right shifted his weight. His hand had been resting on his thigh, and it moved, just slightly, just enough, toward his hip. Elias's eyes went to him, without his head turning. The rider felt the attention and went still again. Last time, Doyle said. His voice had changed now. The pleasantness was gone entirely, stored away wherever he kept it when it wasn't useful. What was left was not rage. Rage is hot and disorganized, and Doyle was neither. What was left was something colder and more functional. Is the boy on your property? The silence stretched out over the dry grass and the road and the cottonwood and the long flat country in every direction. A crow called from somewhere south. The wind moved. No, Elias said. Doyle looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the barn, at the house, at the paddock, at the road south. He was a man who read situations the way a tracker reads ground, patiently, completely, missing very little. Elias watched him read and did not let anything show on his face that wasn't meant to be there. All right, Doyle said at last. He turned back toward his horse. He took the reins from his man and put his foot in the stirrup and looked back at Elias from the saddle. But I'm going to find out. And when I do, I'll be back. I'll be here, Elias said. Doyle touched his hat brim, a gesture that was almost courtesy and was not courtesy at all, and turned the black horse east. The 2 riders fell in behind him. They rode until the road bent, and the cottonwood took them from sight. Elias stood on the porch for a full minute after they disappeared. The crow called again. He breathed out through his nose, long and slow. Then he went inside. Kit was where he'd left him, against the kitchen wall below the window. His face was chalk pale, and his hands were flat on his thighs, and his eyes, when Elias came through the door, were the eyes of someone who has just heard the full dimensions of the danger that has been following them and found it larger than they'd let themselves believe. He'll come back, the boy said. Yes, Elias said. At night, probably, when you can't see them coming as easy. That's how I'd do it, Elias agreed. Kit looked at him. You're not afraid. Elias pulled a chair from the table and sat down and put his hands on his knees and looked back at the boy with the level honesty he'd decided to give him from the beginning, because he'd been lied to by enough adults in whatever life had preceded this barn to know how the alternative felt. I'm afraid, Elias said. I just don't let it make the decisions. Kit was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out the oilcloth parcel and held it in both hands and looked at it. And Elias could see the weight of it. Not the physical weight, which was small, but the other weight, the kind that accumulates when something is the last thing left of something larger. I should tell you what it is, Kit said. Only if you want to, Elias said. The boy looked up. His eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. I want to, he said. I think I need someone else to know. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in long, slow waves, and the road east lay empty under the climbing sun, and somewhere beyond the cottonwood Cutter Doyle was riding away with the patience of a man who is not done. Not done at all. The oilcloth contained a folded piece of paper and a small tin-type photograph. That was all. Elias looked at them on the kitchen table, the photograph face up in the afternoon light. A woman and a man standing in front of a building Elias didn't recognize. The woman with her hand at the man's arm, both of them looking at the camera with the particular formal solemnity of people who have been told to hold still and are trying to look like themselves while doing it. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven, E+T Marsh, Galveston, 1879. Your parents, Elias said. My mother and her brother, Kit said. He was sitting at the table now, his hands flat on either side of the photograph, not touching it. My father left before I can remember him. Marsh is your name. Kit Marsh. He said it like he was testing the weight of it in someone else's presence, seeing if it held. Thomas Marsh was my uncle. He raised me after my mother died. He was a good man. A pause. He died in March. Fever. Elias said nothing. He looked at the photograph and then at the folded paper. That's the deed, Kit said, to property in New Mexico Territory, 40 acres and a house. My uncle left it to me. He looked at the paper but didn't unfold it. Doyle knew my uncle owed him money from a card game 2 years back. When Uncle Thomas died, Doyle said the debt passed to me. Said the property covered it. Said the deed was his. And you ran. I ran. Something shifted in the boy's jaw. Because it isn't his. It was my mother's land before it was my uncle's. It's all that's left of... He stopped. His hands pressed harder against the table. It's all I've got. It's all there is. Elias looked at the boy for a long moment. 40 acres in New Mexico Territory. A tin-type photograph. A dead mother and a dead uncle and a 13-year-old running 4 days across dry country with the double-knotted boots and the large coat and the eyes that swept every room for exits. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, with the same carefulness he brought to spooked horses and cracked fence posts and all the quiet, fragile things that needed handling. And he turned the photograph face down on the table, not to hide it, but to give it rest. Then he stood up and went to the stove and put water on for coffee. "Tell me about your uncle," he said. Kit looked at his back. "Why?" "Because you said he was a good man, and the dead deserved to be spoken of by people who knew them." A long silence from the table. Elias did not turn around. He waited with the patience of a man who has learned that some silences are not empty but full of the work a person is doing to trust. "He made boots," Kit said finally. His voice was quieter. "That's what he did. Had a shop in Galveston for 12 years. Boots and leather goods. He made mine." A pause, and Elias could hear in the pause the shift from recitation to memory, the moment when a person stops telling and starts feeling. He said when he made them to last. He told me to keep them on no matter what. He said. Kit's voice stopped. When it came back, it was smaller, stripped of the careful management he'd been applying to it for days. He said as long as I was wearing them, he was walking with me. Elias stood at the stove and looked at nothing in particular, and let the boy have the silence. He thought about his wife Clara, who had helped him lay the floor of this kitchen and had died in the back bedroom with her hand in his on a Tuesday morning in November, and about how he still touched the wall beside the back door when he passed it because she had touched it, and about how the language of the dead lives in objects and gestures and the specific weight of things you carry because you cannot carry the person. He poured the coffee when it was ready. He brought both cups to the table. He sat down. "What size?" he said. Kit looked at him. "What?" "Your uncle. What size did he make you, those boots?" The boy blinked. The unexpected ordinariness of the question did something to his face, unlocked something that the careful management had been holding in place. "He made them for growing room," Kit said. "He said he'd remake them in 2 years when I'd grown into them." His voice broke on the last word, barely, just at the edge, and he pressed his mouth shut for a moment and looked at the tabletop. Elias wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He sounds like a man who planned ahead." Kit nodded, still looking down. "He was." A breath. Then, almost inaudible, "I miss him." "I know," Elias said. "I don't have anyone else." "I know that too." They sat in the kitchen with the coffee and the afternoon light coming sideways through the west window and the photograph lying face down on the table between them, and the deed folded in its oilcloth, and the boots on the boy's feet that a dead man had made with growing room and the intention of remaking. And the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers, but of something that had begun, without either of them choosing it in so many words, to resemble a kind of understanding. Elias looked at the boots for a long moment. They were wrecked, those boots, the soles worn through, the leather cracked along the instep, the laces grey with road dust. Made well once by careful hands that had loved the person they were made for. Still laced tight, double-knotted, still holding. "After this is settled," Elias said carefully, "we'll see about those soles." Kit looked up at him. Something moved across the boy's face, young and raw, and not yet sure it was allowed to exist, like light testing new ground after a long winter. "You going to let me stay?" Elias looked at the boy across the table. The hollowed eyes, the careful spine, the hands still flat on the table, as though he needed the solidity of the wood beneath them to believe in the reality of the room. He looked at him the way a man looks when he is making a decision he has already made and is now simply finding the words to make it real. "I'm going to do more than that," Elias said. Outside, the sun was dropping toward the ridge and the light was going amber and long across the flats, and the road east lay quiet and gold under the wide sky. But somewhere out there, 3 miles, perhaps 4, 3 horses were watered and rested, and a man with a pleasant voice and cold eyes was watching the same sunset and making his own plans. The night was coming on fast. They came back at 2 in the morning. Elias had not slept. He'd sat in the chair by the front window with the rifle across his knees and the lamp turned down to its lowest possible light. Just enough to see by, not enough to be seen by. And he'd listened to the dark. Kit was in the back room, in the bed that had been the spare bed for 6 years, and the boy had argued about taking it until Elias had said sleep in the quiet voice that left no room for argument, and Kit had slept because he was 13 years old and had been awake for 4 days, and his body was stronger than his pride. The hoofbeats came from the east, riding without lamps. Elias was already on his feet before they reached the gate. He moved to the front door, opened it without sound, and stepped onto the porch with the rifle up and his shoulder against the doorframe. 3 shapes on the road. Then the gate swung open. They'd cut the chain. Quiet work. And 2 of them came through. The third stayed with the horses. Doyle's voice came out of the dark.
"I know you're there, Cord." "I know you are too," Elias said, "and I know you've got no legal standing on this property." A pause. The 2 shapes had stopped just inside the gate. "The boy has what's mine. I'm here to collect a debt." "There is no debt," Elias said. "A card game between a dead man and a living one doesn't transfer to a child. You know that. Any judge in the territory knows that." "I'm not interested in judges," Doyle said. "That's the first honest thing you've said." Elias shifted his weight. "The deed is legitimate. It's registered in Galveston under the name of Eleanor Marsh, transferred to Thomas Marsh upon her death, to pass upon his death to his ward, Christopher Thomas Marsh. That's a legal document, Doyle, witnessed and filed." A silence, longer than the others.
"How do you know what's on that deed?" Doyle said. His voice had a new quality in it. Not quite uncertainty, but its neighbor. "Because the boy showed it to me," Elias said, "and because I spent this afternoon writing a letter to the district court in Santa Fe describing the harassment of a minor by a named individual over a fraudulent debt claim. That letter is in my saddlebag. If I don't post it in Caldwell tomorrow morning, my neighbor to the south, a man named Garrett, who has no goodwill toward men who operate outside the law, will post it for me." There was no neighbor named Garrett. There was no letter, not yet. But the letter would exist by morning, and the neighbor would be Sheriff Dan Pollard in Caldwell, who owed Elias Cord a favor from a winter 4 years back. And Elias Cord had not spent 6 years alone on the flats without learning that the architecture of a threat is not always built from what is, but from what can be made real faster than the other man can act. The silence from the gate stretched out. One of the 2 shapes shifted. Doyle's voice, "Stand down." The shape went still. Doyle walked his horse to the gate. He stood there on the other side of it and looked at the porch and at Elias against the doorframe, and whatever he was calculating moved across the darkness between them like a thing with weight. "This isn't over," Doyle said. "It is on this property," Elias said. "And if you're in Caldwell County by tomorrow sunset, it'll be over in a way that's considerably less comfortable for you." A long, final pause. Then the sound of Doyle turning his horse, the two shapes retreating, the gate swinging shut, not replaced on its chain, but pulled to. Hoofbeats moving west, then fading, then gone. Elias stood on the porch for 10 minutes after the sound disappeared. The stars were enormous overhead, cold and indifferent and beautiful, the way they always are in the territory when the rest of the world has gone quiet. The wind moved the cottonwood, the horse shifted in the paddock. He went inside. Kit was standing in the hallway. He'd heard everything. The way the house was built, with the thin walls and the boards that carried sound, he couldn't have helped it. He was standing in the hallway with his too large coat over his nightshirt and his feet bare on the floor. And when Elias came through the door, the boy's face was doing something it had not done once in the 2 days Elias had known him. It was not doing anything careful at all. "You lied," Kit said, "about the letter, about the neighbor." "I'll write the letter in the morning," Elias said. "That part becomes true." "But tonight." "Tonight I needed him to believe something faster than he could test it." Elias set the rifle against the wall. "That's different from lying. That's buying time." The boy looked at him, his bare feet on the cold floor, his face open in the darkness, unguarded in the way that children's faces go when something has broken through the protection they've built. "He'll go away? For good?" "Men like Doyle move to the next thing," Elias said. "Especially when the next thing has less resistance. We'll file the paperwork properly and make the deed uncontestable. Once that's done, there's nothing for him to collect." He paused. "It takes about 3 weeks to get the paperwork back from Santa Fe." Kit looked at the floor, then back up. 3 weeks. Roughly. A silence. The boy's hands turned at his sides, a small, unconscious gesture, like something that wanted to reach forward and didn't yet know if it was allowed. "I could sleep in the barn," Kit said carefully.
"So I'm not in your way?" "You're not in my way," Elias said. "The back room, then. If that's... It's fine," Elias said. He reached past the boy and opened the door to the back room. It was a small room, clean, with a window that looked south toward the creek. "Go to sleep." Kit stood in the doorway. He turned and looked at Elias one more time, a long look, the kind that is trying to hold something still long enough to trust it. Then he looked down at his feet on the cold floor. "My boots," he said. "I left them by the bed. I should." "You don't have to guard any more," Elias said. The boy looked up. "Whatever you've been carrying," Elias said. "Whatever you've been holding so tight, those boots have been on your feet every waking and sleeping hour. You're inside." "The door's locked. You don't have to guard it tonight." Kit Marsh stood in the doorway of the back bedroom and said nothing. His throat moved, his hands stopped turning at his sides. And something in his face, the careful, managed, constantly calculating expression that had not fully left him once in 2 days, let go. Not all at once, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a fist opens when the thing being held is no longer in danger. He nodded once and went to bed.
In the morning, Elias Cord rode to Caldwell and posted a letter to the district court in Santa Fe, witnessed by Sheriff Dan Pollard, who noted the particulars in the official record without being asked to. The deed to 40 acres in New Mexico Territory was entered into the Territorial Registry under the name of Christopher Thomas Marsh, minor, with a notation that no debt or lien existed against the property. Cutter Doyle left the county within the week. He would surface 2 years later in Arizona, where a dispute over a mining claim ended his career and his life both on a Thursday afternoon in front of a judge who had seen the Santa Fe filing and had no goodwill toward men who harassed children over fraudulent debts. The territorial courts are slow, but they have long memories. Elias resold the boots in October when a cobbler came through Caldwell on his seasonal circuit. Kit stood in the workshop in his socked feet and watched the man work with the focused attention of someone who is learning something and asked 3 questions. Good questions, the kind that come from paying attention and not from showing off. The cobbler answered all 3. When the boots came back, the soles were new, and the boy wore them out of the shop and down the main street of Caldwell without looking at his feet once, which is the truest sign that a pair of boots fits the way it should. He grew into them by the following spring, just as his uncle had made them to do. The paperwork for the New Mexico property sat in a file in the Caldwell courthouse until Kit turned 18, at which point Elias rode with him to the land office in Santa Fe, and the deed transferred formally and legally, and finally into the hands of its rightful owner. They rode back in 2 days, through country that was dry and wide and endlessly blue overhead, and they didn't talk much because they were the kind of people who didn't need to. And the boots on Kit's feet were his 3rd pair by then, made by his own hands in the back room of the Cord property, with a cobbler's tools he'd bought with 2 months of cattle wages and a patience that his uncle would have recognized and been proud of. Years later, when Kit Marsh was a grown man with his own land and his own work, and the particular quiet competence of someone who has been shaped by hard country and good care both, he would sometimes stop in the morning before leaving the house, hand on the door, boot laces fresh tied, and feel the ghost of his uncle's hands in the leather beneath his feet. Not as grief, not any more, as company. The last frame of it, if you could see it from above, a ranch at dawn in the territory, the light coming up golden slow over the ridge, a man on a porch with coffee, and a boy crossing the yard toward the barn with a purpose in his step that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago, unhurried, unguarded, the double knot in his laces not from fear any more, but from habit. And habit, when it grows from love, is the closest thing to permanence this world offers. The door swings open. The morning holds. The boots hit the earth, and they hold.